Let me start by saying this. I didn't go to school to become a teacher. My degree is in legal studies. And before I ever stood at the front of a classroom, I worked in law firms, analyzing case law, reading statutes, preparing trial documents, and helping clients navigate a legal system that's often confusing, intimidating, or unfair. So when I teach U.S. history, I'm not doing it because I'm obsessed with dates or textbook trivia. I'm doing it because I've seen firsthand what happens when people don't understand how power works, when they don't know their rights, when they don't understand the Constitution, when they don't see the legal consequences of silence or ignorance. History isn't just a subject I teach. It's a system I've worked inside of. And I'm here because I know that if you don't understand it, you could be the one left out, misled, or written out of the story entirely. I had a student in my 10th period U.S. history class tell me they didn't need to learn history, that it wasn't important, that it was the past, it wasn't their business, and it had nothing to do with them. This student had a rebuttal for everything I said, but none of it made sense. Not because they aren't smart, but because they don't yet have the knowledge to even be in that conversation. And they're not the only one who feels that way. You've said it. Why should I care about something that happened hundreds of years ago? It doesn't affect me. It's not my problem. But that's where you're wrong. History is your problem because history is how we got here, and it's also the warning about where we could end up. There's a saying, a smart person learns from their own mistakes. A wise person learns from the mistakes of others. Let's choose wisdom. Every right you have today, to go to school, to speak freely, to be treated fairly under the law, exists because people before you stood up and demanded it. They studied what went wrong. They figured out how power worked, and then they changed the system. If you don't understand what they were fighting against, if you don't know what laws were passed, what power was abused, or what rights were denied, you won't even see it coming when it happens again. Let's be real, America was founded by rebels. The founding fathers didn't politely ask for independence. They demanded it. The Declaration of Independence is basically a formal, "We're done with you" letter to Great Britain. It lists every reason they believed they were being treated unfairly and makes it clear they weren't going to take it anymore. And the Boston Tea Party, that was an act of political defiance. They dumped an entire shipment of tea into the harbor, not because they hated tea, but because they knew that freedom without representation isn't freedom at all. The people who created this country were willing to fight, risk everything, and go completely against the system they lived under. Why? Because they believed liberty was worth it. They didn't wait for someone to give them permission. They understood that sometimes, when something is wrong, you go rogue to make it right. That's the root of our democracy, and that's why we study history. Not just to learn what happened, but to understand what people were willing to stand up for, and what it means to protect your rights when it really matters. Let me give you a few more examples. In the early 1800s, Native nations were forced off their land by the federal government. This was the Indian Removal Act, and it led to what we now call the Trail of Tears. Thousands of people died, marched away from their homes, all because land and profit were valued over human lives. That outcome, death by forced movement, is hauntingly similar to what took place in Europe during the Holocaust, when people were marched from one place to another under brutal conditions. It didn't happen over there because they were different. It happened because people stopped paying attention to how power was being used. Next, let's look at the Civil War, a war over freedom, federal authority, and who counted as fully human. Afterward, constitutional amendments redefined citizenship and expanded democracy, but only because people demanded change. If they hadn't, many of the students in this very classroom would still legally be counted as less than a full person. Now let's talk about something almost no one remembers: the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These laws allowed the government to silence critics, arrest immigrants, and deport people just for being seen as a threat to the system. One of those laws, the Alien Enemies Act, was never repealed. And during World War II, it was used to justify the internment of thousands of Japanese American citizens. Families lost their homes, businesses, and rights, not because of what they did, but because of who they were. That law still exists. And as of this year, it's being used again. On May 6, 2025, a federal judge ruled that the recent use of the Alien Enemies Act to carry out deportations did not meet the legal standard required by the Constitution. The court said the government hadn't shown that the situation qualified as an invasion, as defined by the 1798 law. But here's the thing: deportations had already begun, based solely on nationality and vague accusations, not solid evidence or due process. Now think about that. A law from 1798, passed before electricity, before modern medicine, before any of us were born, is still being used to strip people of their rights. That's how powerful old laws can be when no one knows or no one notices what they actually allow. If that doesn't make history feel real, I don't know what will. And if you think child labor is just some outdated topic from the Industrial Revolution, think again. In 1900, children worked in coal mines and textile mills. They lost fingers in machines. They missed school. They were used and discarded by companies that prioritized profit over protection. That's why child labor laws were created in the first place. And here in Florida, right now in 2025, lawmakers tried to take us backward. Two bills, SB 918 and HB 12225, were introduced that would have allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to work unlimited hours during the school year with no breaks. They would have allowed 14 and 15-year-olds in virtual school to work overnight shifts, even if they had school the next day. The U.S. Department of Labor reports that child labor violations in Florida are at their second highest level in the last 15 years. This isn't ancient history, this is now. What's the connection to history? We've seen this before. In the early 1900s, we fought to end this kind of exploitation. We created rules so that students could go to school instead of sacrificing their health for a paycheck. And now, we're watching those protections quietly disappear, just like how rights disappear when no one's paying attention. This is why history matters. Because if you don't know what your rights are, or why they were created, you'll never notice when they're taken away. And here's the most important part: the bill didn't pass. Despite clearing the Florida House, HB 1225 died in the Senate after intense public backlash. And who pushed back? People, including students just like you. Young people learned what the bill actually said. They connected it to our past. They asked questions. They made noise. And the system responded. It wasn't luck. It wasn't magic. It was education, awareness, action. That's what happens when people understand their history and use that understanding to speak up. That's what this class is about. Not just memorizing facts, but preparing you to recognize what's right, what's wrong, and what you can do about it. And while slavery was officially abolished in 1865, that didn't mean every injustice disappeared overnight. In fact, new legal systems emerged, particularly in the South, that made it easier to arrest individuals for minor infractions. Once incarcerated, many were required to work, often under harsh conditions, and often for little or no pay. Even today, there are ongoing discussions about the role of prison labor, with some incarcerated individuals performing manual labor on farms or in factories. These realities raise important civic questions. What is the purpose of punishment? Who decides? And how do these systems evolve? These are questions people continue to debate, and they can't be understood unless you know the history that shaped them. That's why we study slavery. Not just how it started, but how its effects still echo through systems today. Here's the truth. Democracy is not permanent. It is not automatic. It is not indestructible. It requires participation, understanding, vigilance. That's why I teach you history. Not so you can recite names and dates, not so you become professors or politicians, but so you can recognize when power is being used unfairly and understand what people before you did about it. That's why we study colonialism and revolution, not because they're distant, but because they show how systems are built and what people fought for. That's why we study slavery and abolition, not to make anyone feel bad or ashamed. This isn't about guilt. It's about understanding how it happened, why it happened, how it ended, and how it still echoes today. That's why we study the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the amendments, because these documents shape your rights right now. And if you don't understand them, you won't know when they're being changed, bent, or quietly taken. You don't have to agree with everything that happened in history. You don't even have to be comfortable with it. But you do have to be aware. Because if you go through life unaware, uninterested, uninformed, people in power will write the story for you. And you might not like how it ends. So no, you don't need to be a lawyer or a scholar. But you do need to be an informed citizen. Because informed citizens are harder to silence, harder to manipulate, and harder to push around. And that is why this class matters. People love to say they want to go back to the good old days. But good for whom? And what exactly do they want to go back to? Because when we look back clearly, when we really study history, we realize that the good old days were often only good for the few who held the power. History isn't about blame. It's about awareness. It's about readiness. It's about choosing not to repeat the worst parts of the past because you've studied them and you recognize the signs. So don't zone out. Don't roll your eyes. Don't sleepwalk through this. Pay attention, ask questions, stay ready. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what happens next. And you are in it.